Attendees are in listen-only mode. Webinar. We're going to spend the next hour talking with you about revalidation. We're just going to pause momentarily while we wait for colleagues to log in. So you'll still see the screen, but the microphone will be on silent. You might want to take a moment just to familiarise yourself with the documents. The presentation will appear, but in addition to that there is guidance and FAQs that are in the documents section, which should appear on the right-hand side of your screen as you're facing it. I'm just going to put the microphone on pause for a moment while we wait for everyone to sign in. Thank you for that, colleagues. Sorry for that slight pause. Okay, so my name is Gail Adams and I'm the Head of Nursing for UNISON. I have two colleagues with me here today who will be helping to identify your questions, Tareen and James. And as I said earlier, we're going to spend the next hour talking together about revalidation. Just before we move into the actual session, we've got some questions that we want to ask you, really just to get a sense of how confident or worried you are about revalidation. So the first question is whether or not you're worried about revalidation. So if you are worried, then obviously answer yes. If you feel quite confident about it already, then answer no. Okay, so at the minute, approximately 96% of you are indicating that you are worried about revalidation. So I'm hoping that during the next hour we'll help to address some of those concerns that you might have. But if there are issues afterwards, then we can also do some follow-up work. In addition to that, you'll see that there's a questions section. So if there are any questions that you've got during the webinar, then please just populate them at any point. And we'll try to group the questions under certain headings because I'm sure that a number of you may well have similar concerns about the same issue. The next poll question is about the NMC. So can I just ask how many of you have already gone to the NMC online and registered? If you can answer that question, please. Okay, so 86% of you are already registered with NMC online. So I'm hoping that the next and final question before we get into the detail of the presentation will be quite straightforward. How many of you know when your revalidation date is due? So yes, you know when your revalidation date is due, or no, you don't. Okay, so 70% of you know when your revalidation date is due and 25% of you at the moment don't. Okay, so we'll go through the method that you can definitely find out exactly when your revalidation date is due during the presentation. So I want to start by just reminding us all about what revalidation is. So very simply, every year you pay the NMC your annual registration fee, which is currently £120, but every 3 years you're required to confirm that you're suitable to remain on the register. The previous system we had for that was PrEP. On this slide and in our guidance we've included a link to NMC online. For those of you who have registered and know when your revalidation date is, you will recall that that appeared when you registered online with the NMC. It appeared on the right-hand side of their web screen. So for those of you who've registered online but you're not sure about the revalidation date, it will appear immediately underneath your NMC PIN number on the right-hand side of the NMC online when you log in. And for the small number of you who haven't already registered with NMC online, please do so, because it's really important that you get that date and you pop it in your diary now. I want to move us on to the Code of Conduct, and this is important in revalidation for a number of reasons. Firstly, I just want to remind us that this is a new Code of Conduct that was launched on the 31st of March 2015. It was revised in the wake of the Mid Staffordshire report into care failings, and it has got a number of similarities with the old one, but more importantly there are new sections in there. So I'd encourage you to make sure you've got a copy of the code. You can download one from the NMC website. On mine I've kind of scrawled all over it to help me become more familiar with it. We've included the link on the NMC website where you can download this document yourself. The reason that this is important to revalidation is that all of your evidence in your practice-related feedback and also in your pieces of reflection have to tie into the NMC. So if you think of it as a triangle, with the NMC being one point of the triangle with the Code of Conduct, your practice-related feedback being one point at the bottom and your pieces of professional reflections being the other. So they have to triangulate. So any evidence that you have in your portfolio, you need to demonstrate its link to the code, because that helps to show the NMC how familiar you are with your code and how you make its use part of your everyday practice. I also want to take just a minute to remind ourselves why the code changed. So I've already mentioned the Mid Staffordshire public inquiry, and revising the Code of Conduct was one of the 120 recommendations that Sir Robert Francis made in his report. But as importantly, the previous system that we had to prep wasn't working. The NMC should have audited 10% of portfolios on an annual basis, and they didn't do this. As part of the preparatory work to design the revalidation system, they did undertake a sample audit, but it cost them £350 to look per portfolio. So obviously that system really wasn't working, and if they continued with that and continued to sample that number, there's no doubt in my mind that it would have directly led to an increase in registration fees, which isn't something that anyone would have wanted to support. The system was also quite antiquated, it wasn't really current, and in a way it was just behind times. So it was right and proper that it was reviewed. And UNISON was involved in the revalidation design from the start, but we made three lines for us, 3 lines in the sand for the NMC having our support in developing the revalidation system. The first was that it had to be risk-based and it had to be proportionate. That's important to us because less than 0.05% of registrants are ever referred to the NMC or have their practice called into question. And currently the NMC regulates over 680,000 nurses and midwives. So that means that every day 99.999% of you are going to work and you're doing a great job. So we couldn't have a system that was disproportionate because most of you are doing fantastic work. Secondly, it couldn't lead to an increase in registration fees. It had to be risk-based, it had to be proportionate, and it couldn't lead to an increase in professional registration fees. In my personal opinion, you already pay too much. The third line for us is that whether you're a nurse or a midwife, whether you work in the NHS, the private sector, social care sector, or the independent sector, you had to use the same revalidation system. So it had to be capable of working for any practitioner, irrespective of what their area of practice is. And to the main, the NMC so far have stuck to those red lines. So that gives you a bit of background as to what happened and why it's changing. So let's move on now to the NMC itself and to the new system. So we've included in the presentation links to the NMC website. They've established and are updating regularly a new microsite that has lots of information that they've produced about revalidation. It also includes all of the documents, so the revalidation guidance that they have produced, in addition to template forms. And I'm going to go through some of the template forms. But of all of the forms that are there are only 3 that have to be used. The rest are optional. So I'd encourage you to have a look at the microsite, to become more familiar, to make sure that you read their guidance, but you might find it easy to start with the UNISON guidance because it's a lot shorter and it's a lot simpler to understand, and it will put some of the NMC's detailed information into context. So what does the new system of revalidation look like? So from the 1st of April 2016, anyone who's renewing their registration will have to demonstrate 450 hours of practice hours over the preceding 3 years. If you have a dual registration, and by that I mean if you're a nurse and a midwife, and you wish to maintain both parts of your registration, then you have to demonstrate 900 hours over the previous 3-year period. And for that small number of people who have that dual registration of being a nurse and a midwife, there's some further information on the NMC website. In addition to that, you have to demonstrate 35 hours of continuous professional development, 20 hours of which have to be participatory, learning with others. You have to have 5 pieces of practice-related feedback and 5 pieces of professional character, and you need to undergo a period of confirmation and continue to be of good health and good character. I'm going to go through each of those in turn now. So the 450 hours of practice, on the NMC website they have a Word document that enables you to record your hours. I think it's quite complicated personally, and what you have to do is to make sure that any hours you record there's an audit trail, so it would be easy for anyone to be able to be reassured that you have met that criteria. So for me, in my portfolio, I have got a copy of my job description at the front. I have then written 3 or 4 paragraphs about what my job is. So I've included the work that I do on policy, the work that I do in supporting and helping members, but I've written it very much as if somebody who had no idea about the job that I did was reading it. So you might find it helpful to do the same and to avoid using jargon. And then I've simply inserted a printout of my calendar for the previous 2 years, and I have anonymised some personal information where I've had members with meetings with members. Equally, if you're using electronic staff records, you could do a printout of your rota. I've also included a record of my annual leave, so it's clear that they're the periods of absence due to annual leave. You can use your own system, you can have a diary, you can print out an electronic calendar, you can use e-rostering, but you have to make sure that there is a clear correlation in that explains clearly the hours you've worked and where you worked them, and by that I mean the scope of practice with which you were working them. So you were working them as a nurse or as a midwife, etc. And as I said, they can include bank and agency hours, but they have to look back. Other evidence that you can use payslips, but payslips are not always an accurate record, because normally they would indicate what contractual hours you are scheduled to work. They don't necessarily mean that you worked those hours. So, for example, a payslip wouldn't record that you had had 2 days off sick, as a hypothetical, but you could use a copy of a payslip as an example to corroborate other evidence that you provide. I want to move on to the 35 hours of CPD. So there seems to be a lot of anxiety around CPD, so I want to spend a little bit of time on this. The way that I've approached CPD is I'm not calling it CPD, I'm calling it learning, because it seems to help crystallise the information that people need to document in it. So as I mentioned at the beginning, you have to undertake 30 hours of continuous professional development or learning, 20 of which have to be participatory. It can be any kind of professional learning that you believe is relevant to your practice. So it could, for example, include mandatory training on basic life support or on safeguarding. I wouldn't advocate using all mandatory training. Training that every member of staff has irrespective of their role. And the reason for that is it's not always as easy to relate that kind of training to your practice. But equally, if you're introducing a new piece of equipment and you're having training on it, that can count. That could even, if you're learning about that piece of equipment with others, that could count as participatory learning. Seminars can count, study days can count, attendance at conferences, presentations at conferences can count. You could use peer review, you could use clinical audit. For those of you who act as a mentor or supporting students or new members of staff, you can also use part of that as evidence of your learning. But just remember that only 20 have to be participatory. On the NMC website, there is a form that you can record your CPD hours, but again, it doesn't have to be as comprehensive. You need to be able to clearly identify what learning you have undertaken, and in addition to that, how many hours it was. So again, when I developed my portfolio, I just got all of my previous prep evidence and I reordered it under the new heading, so I could see immediately what gaps I had in my evidence. And for me, there was a gap in my CPD. I actually had only had 8 hours of participatory learning. My revalidation is due next year, so in my recent development review, I included needing access to CPD as part of my development review, in order that I can revalidate. And there's nothing to stop you all doing the same as well. So it's learning that you believe informs your practice, and it's up to you to identify it. It could be reading a particular article and what you gain from that. It can be classroom, but participatory doesn't have to be classroom. There are lots of ways that we all learn as part of that process. I'll just remind you that you can ask questions at any point. Just type the question in, and my colleague Tareen is coordinating them under headings. I'm going to move on to the practice-related feedback requirement now, and this is one of the new sections in revalidation. So we're always gaining feedback from those that we're caring for, but we sometimes bat it back a bit, you know, using phrases like, I was simply doing my job, or it's what I do, instead of acknowledging and appreciating the feedback. So you can, in your portfolio, use verbal feedback. You need to make sure you anonymise any patient information, but you could, for example, if a patient or a client was giving you feedback, jot a note down on it, but also make sure that you're reflecting on how that relates to your practice. It could also be from students that you've mentored or supported. It can be from surveys that you undertake where patients are experiencing care from your organisation. It can be formal feedback as part of that process. So one question we've received is about participatory learning. So participatory learning is when you learn with others. So if there are 2, 3 or 4 of you learning something together, you can evidence that as participatory learning. So of the 35 hours that you have to demonstrate, 20 have to be participatory, evidence of learning where you have learned with other people. With the practice-related feedback, you have to have 5 examples, and they also need to link to the code. So in the code there are different headings around care, communication, documentation. So it's good to use feedback of where you can cite different evidence in the code of conduct. It can also be evidence or feedback that your entire team has received. You only need 5 examples. You can put more in if you wish, but it is unnecessary. So just bear that in mind. You know, this is about making sure that you revalidate. It's not about writing essays. So in my practice-related feedback, each of my feedback sections are perhaps like 3 or 4 paragraphs of where I've said, you know, what the feedback was, what impact it had. If it was good feedback, I demonstrated my appreciation, articulated how appreciative I was of the feedback and how it reassured me that I was meeting the code. Feedback that wasn't as that was more constructive and that perhaps had areas where I could reflect on, I've also done that and demonstrated that. So it's just 5 pieces of practice-related feedback. I'm going to move on to the reflections now. So again, you need 5 pieces of reflection, and in the UNISON guidance that's on the side where documents are, there are some links to articles on how to undertake reflection. For many now, it is included within the pre-registration nursing standards, but perhaps for some like myself, a slightly more mature nurse, it wasn't included in our nurse education. It's very much something that we've had to learn subsequently. So you can use any method to undertake your reflections, and we've simply included a few web links that take you through some articles that hopefully will enable you to be more confident undertaking that. All of your reflections need to link to the code, and again, they could be a reflection on something good, something that's gone well in the care that you have delivered. It could, for example, be that you were able to make time to sit with somebody who was distressed. It could be that a patient was particularly worried about something and you were able to reassure them. It could be an incident that has occurred at work, how you and the team dealt with it and how it made you feel. But you need to make sure that you document it, and you document 5. Once you've undertaken your pieces of reflection, the first element of mandatory documentation comes in. So in here, on the NMC website, there is a form of where your pieces of reflection, that you have to document your pieces of reflection on. And in addition to that, there is another document, because after your reflections, you're required to have a professional conversation about your pieces of reflections with another registrant. So that's a single conversation with another registrant about your 5 pieces of reflections. So one conversation about the 5 pieces of evidence, and they will be required to sign a form giving their NMC registration details, corroborating that the discussion took place, when it took place, and a short outline of the nature of what was discussed. We don't seem to have any questions about the pieces of reflection, so I'm hoping that has been quite clear. I just stress again that you only need to undertake 5. I think some people are sometimes being anxious that they need more evidence. In order to revalidate, you need 5 pieces of practice-related feedback and 5 pieces of reflection. There's not a gold star for revalidation where if you do more, you're going to gain a higher level of revalidation. So just bear that in mind. It's much more simple to just do the 5 and 5 and be confident in what you're doing. I'm going to move on to the next section, which is indemnity insurance. And again, you don't have to have evidence of indemnity insurance physically in your portfolio. Some registrants have been misled to believe that they have to have a copy of a certificate in their portfolio. That is not the case. You must have indemnity insurance cover in place, and you will be asked when you revalidate if you have that cover, and you will tick a box. Now, for 99.9% of registrants, it's simple. You have a contract of employment and you are employed, and by the nature of your employment, you have indemnity insurance because your employer remains vicariously liable for your practice. There are a very small number of individuals who are completely autonomous, independent practitioners, and for them, they need to make sure that they have indemnity insurance in place. For the overwhelming majority of registrants, it will be in place by the nature of your employment. And if you are employed or you work in the NHS, then you're covered by the NHS scheme. So just to stress, you don't have to have evidence in your portfolio of this, but you do have to have the insurance in place. Many trade unions, including us, including UNISON, has indemnity insurance in place as part of its trade union membership. One question that we have received is about the length of the pieces of reflection. And again, the NMC, there's no set specification here. So if you're a very confident writer and you can do your pieces of reflection in 2 or 3 paragraphs, then that's absolutely fine. You need to, you're not writing an essay. This is not an essay on reflection. It is a particular piece of reflection you have undertaken on something that has taken place. So mine are about 3/4 of a page each. They are not precise detail. There is a summary of what took place, my reflections on it, and I have documented that. In terms of indemnity insurance, someone's popped up the question about agency workers. So agency workers, again, those who work agency in the independent sector and or in the NHS are covered. Agency staff who work completely in isolation, in particular in the private practice, and most definitely if you're working within private practice in the cosmetic industry, then you need to make sure that you have indemnity insurance in place. In terms of the indemnity insurance, one of you has queried the value of indemnity insurance. There's a couple of things that I'd say about this, and again, I think people become confused with indemnity insurance because the level of indemnity insurance you have simply is the level with which someone can have litigation taken against them. So our indemnity insurance cover is up to £1 million, but the vast majority of people who ever make an insurance claim would make a claim against an employer, not an individual. If there are other questions about indemnity insurance, in this slide we've also included a link to the UNISON's indemnity insurance fact sheet and the information on our website, so you can have a look at that. In terms of feedback, can I use, one question's been, can I use organisational feedback? Yes, of course you can. If you believe that the feedback that you have received relates to your practice, then you can use it. I've used feedback around developing the revalidation sessions. I've used all kinds of feedback from individuals, from organisations, and also from other charities. So if you can relate it to your practice, as a registrant, you are using your professional judgment to decide which you feel is relevant. So if it relates to your practice and you can link it to the code of conduct, so long as you can tick those 2 components, you can do so. And as I said, your pieces of reflection, you have to use the NMC templates for that, but not the practice-related feedback. So the first 2 mandatory forms that you have to use with the NMC documents are for your professional reflections and also to document the professional conversation that you have had with another member of the profession. Okay, another question about documents. Sorry, I didn't see that properly. Do all of the documents have to be downloaded to an online portfolio? Okay, so nothing has to be sent to the NMC. The only thing that you will use on the NMC, in terms of documents on the NMC website, is when you revalidate, you will go through certain boxes, and I'm going to come to that, so I'm going to come back to that question. My recommendation personally at this moment in time is to invest in a little folder from WH Smith's. Other retailers of that nature are available. There are some online systems. The challenge with those is you don't necessarily own the online system. So if the online system is with your employer and you change employment, it's not clear whether that online system will transfer with you to your new employer. In addition to that, if you have no control over how you can access information, it isn't always as portable as you wish it to be. So there is nothing to stop you having a physical portfolio and keeping this information. And I will come back to the other component around practice as we get to it. So the final few slides, the next is about health and character. So when you revalidate on the NMC website, it will ask you if you have good health and character. This is predominantly around anyone who may have a significant long-term condition which could affect their ability to practice. So the vast majority of you are just going to tick yes, that you are of good health and good character. The reason that I'm flagging this up here is one of the changes to the Code of Conduct is about reporting information to the NMC. So previously, if for some reason a nurse was disciplined and dismissed or suspended, or if they had were subject to some kind of police investigation, under the previous Code of Conduct, it was recommended that nurses self-refer. Under this Code of Conduct, it's a requirement. Okay, that's not necessarily going to preclude you from registering, but it is important that you are aware of that change. And again, this will be a tick system on the NMC system. So what I'd advise you all to do, again, is to make sure that you're registered with the NMC online. Note your revalidation date. Note the 3 documents which are mandatory on the NMC's microsite. That is the pieces of reflection, which there is a form that you have to record your pieces of professional reflection on, and in addition to that, the professional conversation that has to take place. With regard to your documents, again, just to stress, I am not saying that you cannot use online portfolios. There are a number that exist, but most of those are charging you as well, and you do not necessarily need to pay, because you can keep evidence in any type of folder that you have automatic control of. So personally, I'm not using an online folder because I want complete control of my evidence at all time, and as I said, the ones that I looked at, I was worried about whether they were completely portable. So the final stage of this process is confirmation. Now, the NMC's guidance recommend that it's your line manager who acts as your confirmer, but for some that's not straightforward. So what we have asked employers is, we're not saying it can't be your line manager by any size, shape or form, but we are saying that you should have a little bit of flexibility. So if for some reason you have concerns about your line manager being your confirmer, perhaps, for example, they're your best friend and you socialise with them and you'd rather this stay completely independent. It could be you've had a previous disagreement with them and you're slightly worried about that. It doesn't matter what the reason is. What we have simply requested is that there is an alternative. So if for some reason you believe that it wouldn't be appropriate for your line manager to act as your confirmer, then you have got an alternative process. The other thing to stress about confirmation is it doesn't have to happen immediately before you revalidate. So you can have the confirmers discussion ahead of revalidation. And as I said, the other advice, the confirmer does not have to be a nurse or a midwife. They can be, but they don't have to be. The only person that does have to be a registrant is the one that you have the conversation with about your pieces of professional reflection. And there is a document on the NMC website that your confirmer must complete. So just to reassure you, there is an expectation that you will revalidate. The system is quite straightforward, albeit it's new and people will be worried about it. If for some reason you have anxieties about not being able to revalidate, for example, if you've had a very long period of sickness absence, perhaps you have had a long period off following maternity leave, if you do not believe that you can meet any of the standards, then the advice that we would give is as soon as you hear from the NMC, and you should hear from them approximately 3 months before your actual revalidation is due, contact them straight away. Explain the circumstances to them, that you're worried that due to this particular circumstance that's unique to you, you may not be able to meet the revalidation criteria, and have that conversation with them. There are exceptional circumstances by which there is some flexibility the NMC can adapt. The other person that I would strongly urge you to contact if that unique set of circumstances affects you is to make sure that you're speaking to your local UNISON rep, because they will also be able to help you raise that concern locally. But the flip side works of that as well. So if, for example, you think you're going to be off on maternity leave when you're pregnant, then there is nothing to preclude you bringing forward your confirmation discussion with your line manager or another person so that you can still revalidate. So it's about being proactive. Ignoring something from the NMC is never a good idea. So as I said, the most important thing is if you feel for some reason due to long absences or a particular issue that you may not be able to revalidate, as soon as you hear from the NMC, contact them and start to have that conversation with them. And at the same time, alert your local UNISON rep, because it may well be that we need to provide some additional support to you as an individual. I want to spend a couple of minutes just going through some of the myths that have been emerging around revalidation. So the first one I want to take you through is that your confirmer physically needs to be by your side when you complete your NMC online revalidation application. This isn't the case. Confirmation is a completely separate process, and no one other than yourself needs to be present when you fill in the online information. Everything else that you need, you will have access to in your portfolio and as part of your evidence. The next myth is the one that I hope I've already covered, but again, just to reiterate, some people originally thought that they had to have different conversations with different registrants around their pieces of reflection. So each reflective account with a different person, and this is not the case. As I stressed earlier on, but let me just repeat to reassure you, you have a single conversation with another registrant about your 5 pieces of reflection, and that person completes one form, and that form corroborates the conversation that you have had. The other is about what information what you do with your information. So again, I think this myth emerged because during the pilots, registrants who were subject to revalidation during the pilot site had to upload information onto the NMC website. So the little gem is that you do not have to upload any information whatsoever onto the NMC website as part of revalidation. When they undertook this in the pilot, the NMC's website and the NHS's website didn't like each other. You know how those NHS firewalls preclude you from accessing some particular sites? Well, rather ironically, they precluded the registrants in the pilot from being able to upload any information. So as a result of that, it was changed, and now you upload nothing onto the NMC website. The final couple of myths, because I just want to make sure that everyone addresses these because they have caused some anxiety, is that your confirmer has to be a registered nurse or a midwife. Again, that is a myth. They do not. The only person who has to be a registrant is the person who you have the professional conversation with about your pieces of reflection. If your confirmer is also a nurse or a midwife, then that's fine, but they do not have to be. And that's really important because some of us work in isolation. We don't necessarily have immediate or direct access to a nurse or a midwife. However, they do have to know you and know your job. So it does have to be someone who is familiar with you and familiar with your practice. The next myth is that you have to be employed in a role providing direct patient care, otherwise you're unable to renew your registration. Again, this isn't the case. All of your evidence has to relate to your scope of practice. So if you are, for example, employed full-time in a research post in a laboratory as a nurse and you do not physically see patients, that is your scope of practice, and all of your hours and evidence has to relate to that. It's the same if you are, for example, a lecturer and you're based solely in the university. That is your scope of practice, and all of your hours will also relate to that scope of practice in the university. I personally do not physically practice as a nurse providing direct care now, but I am still going to be able to revalidate because my scope of practice is as the head of nursing for UNISON. So all of my evidence relates to that process. So I'm going to take a pause to answer some additional questions that we have had in. I've done that. Somebody has asked whether they can mention that you're a UNISON member. There's no reason why that has to be precluded, but it would, again, it needs to relate to your practice. So if you are using example of information you have developed or how you have supported somebody through being a UNISON member, or if you have attended, for example, some of our professional seminars, then you can do that. And certainly for indemnity insurance, you can simply say that you are a member of UNISON if that's what that question related to. My portfolio, right, okay, so somebody is using RCN eyesight. Yes, that's fine. If, as I said, stress to you, I'm by no means am I saying do not use an online system. I'm simply saying that you need to reassure yourself that it is portable. So if you change jobs, you take it with you. The only thing I would say about the RCNI is that it is an online site that you have to pay a small fee for. You wouldn't have to pay that small fee if you physically went and purchased a portfolio and contained all of your evidence in that system. So it's entirely up to you. My personal choice is that I'm still keeping a hard copy, but as you know, as any professional, you will make your own decision. All of the revalidation criteria apply over the previous 3 years. So as I mentioned earlier on, your evidence has to relate to, your practice hours have to relate to the previous 3 years, and any of your practice related feedback or your pieces of reflection can relate to anything that's happened over the previous 3 years. So you're in effect, you're looking back retrospectively at your practice over the previous 3-year period on anything. I've had a question about someone on maternity leave, and you know, so yes, as I said, you're looking back. So if you're on maternity leave now, then you can use your hours and any training in the previous 3 years prior to when your revalidation date is due, and there's nothing to preclude you doing that. But equally, if you're worried about that the timing of your maternity leave may impact on your ability to revalidate. You know, for example, you might, if your revalidation date is due very soon and you're quite early on post having the baby, and you may not be able to get in and have the conversation with your confirmer, then again, that's something that you can discuss with the NMC and or get some local help from UNISON. As I said, we were very particular with the NMC that they had to put in circumstances that, extenuating circumstances that individuals could face, in particular in the early days of revalidation being introduced, because it is so new. Right, in terms of, we've had another question about someone who's been asked by their sister manager to get staff onto the e-learning system in work. Can I use those hours I've done as my CPD evidence? If you can relate them to practice, yes, you can use them. But again, I would also want reassurance if you move from that employer, what happens to the evidence that you provided on the online system? Is it going to be portable? Okay, so I just want to go through a final couple of things. And the next slide is really my sort of top tip. So as I said, the most important thing, and this is why I have to make a confession, because normally I am a last-minute Nancy. When I was a student, my assignments, if they were due in tomorrow, they'd be written at 2 o'clock this morning. This is the one occasion where I have finally got myself ahead of the curve. So I have gone onto the NMC online, I have registered, I know my revalidation date is due in April 2017. So I have my portfolio, I've reordered my previous prep portfolio into the new headings, I've identified where my gaps are in my evidence, and I have started to address those gaps. On my CPD, I've included it in my development portfolio. So my strong advice is sort of not to put your head in the sand and think that revalidation will go away, because it will not. Once you know when your revalidation date is, put it in your diary. I've given myself a 3-month reminder and a 6-month reminder as a prompt, and in addition to that, you will also be able to access support from your employer. It's in their interest for you to revalidate, okay? It's not in their interest for you not to do so, because if you do not revalidate, you are lapsed from the NMC register, and that's in neither your best interest or in your employer's best interest, because it can affect their staffing levels and therefore care provision. So just make sure that you're ahead of yourself and that you're not leaving it to the last minute, and that you are going through and collecting your evidence. I promise you, if I can go through this process, anyone can go through this process. But I appreciate that it's new. I appreciate that it's a different system. And I very much acknowledge that when something is new and when it is different, we all get just a little bit nervous. But I assure you, there is nothing to preclude anyone going through the revalidation system. So we've included here a link. When you go onto the NMC microsite, there are some tablets that you can click. One of those will take you to documents and templates. One of them will take you to the film. So I'm now going to demonstrate the NMC film on revalidation. You will go onto the NMC website. It will ask you to input some information that will include your name, your address, your employer, the country that you currently practice in. It will ask you a series of questions. Have you completed your 450 hours? Click on the mouse, because yes, I have. Have you completed your 35 hours of continuous professional development? Click on the mouse, because yes, I have. Then the same for your pieces of practice-related feedback, your reflections, your professional conversation on your reflections, your confirmation, your health and character. It will not let you submit the form until you have answered the required questions. And then, rather like when you pay your registration fee, you get an acknowledgement of it. Very quickly you will receive confirmation that you have revalidated. So you are uploading no information, you are just providing limited information to the NMC, which you will type in and clicking yes to a number. Have a look at some of those films, they are particularly helpful. I think in particular the one about completing the actual revalidation will help to reassure you on a number of things. And finally, before we address any outstanding questions, I just really encourage you to be revalidation ready. A number of our branches are conducting revalidation workshops up and down the country. So make sure they will be advertised in your local organisation, and in addition to that you will be able to access our revalidation information on our website. On the right hand side of the screen you will see all of the documents, so you have access to this presentation, you also have access to our guidance, and you have access to the frequently asked questions that we have developed. On the UNISON Revalidation website we will be updating information. I understand that some of you may have had difficulty with sound this afternoon, so my sincere apologies if any of you have not been able to hear any particular issue, but we will be scheduling a whole series of revalidation webinars, and there is nothing to preclude you registering again because they will be advertised to everyone. I want to just take a brief moment to revisit some of those questions that we asked early on before we mop up any outstanding question. So the next question is whether or not, as a result of this webinar, you now feel more confident about revalidation than you did earlier on. So if you now feel more confident than you did earlier, answer yes. If it's made no difference, then obviously answer no. Okay, that's great. So 84% of you are saying that you feel more confident now than you did, and approximately 16 to 18% of you, because it's fluctuating still a little bit, are still quite uncertain. The final question that we want to ask is about the UNISON material and whether you found the material on the webinar, that's the documents that are there, have you found them helpful? So again, if you found them helpful, you answer yes. If you haven't, say no. Someone's just asked a question about, do you have to use different people every 3 years? I'm assuming you mean the person who you have the professional conversation with about your reflections. If that's the question that you're answering, no, I mean, it can be the same person. The only thing that I would say is sometimes it is helpful if you do engage with other people, because you develop professional relationships with people over time. So when I'm getting feedback, I work very closely with my colleagues Tareen and James, but they know me very well, and when you know someone very well, you become used to the way that they're working. So sometimes you're not always as honest with feedback as you could be. So I make sure I get feedback from senior staff, from my peers, from junior staff, and also from people outside the organisation, because it just helps me to think about how I come across and help me reflect on my practice. So I hope that today's session has been helpful. As I said, I apologise if some of you have had a technical issue with the sound, but we will be rescheduling further webinars. Just before we finish, I just want to remind you that now you've participated in the webinar, on the website, one of the documents is the attendance certificate. So you can print off this certificate. You will need to record in your CPD hours its information and what you gained from today. So you can use that as an hour of your participatory learning. And in addition to that, what you simply need to do is to make a few notes about what you gained from the session, how it informed your understanding of revalidation, what you're going to do now to prepare for it, and that will enable you to use the certificate as part of your CPD. So I hope that you found it helpful this afternoon, and as I said, we will reschedule more. When the webinar closes down, you'll receive a web link, That web link is asks you to undertake a quick survey. It's just for us to gain some feedback about use of webinar, as it's quite a new technological document and system, and we want to see whether actually it's a medium that we could use in the future on a range of other nursing and professional issues to help you be more confident in your practice. The certificate is contained in the documents section, which should be on the right hand side of your screen. So where the presentation is and where the guidance is, you'll find the certificate. So I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you very much for participating. I've been really impressed and pleased with the number of questions that you've posed. If there's anything you're not quite sure of, then you can email in to us and we'll try to answer other questions. But as I said, you will find that there are revalidation workshops that UNISON is running locally, and there's nothing to preclude you attending them or even joining us for a subsequent webinar. We'll end the webinar now, but we'll keep the line open for a moment to enable you to download any of the documents that you wish to access. So thank you very much. Have a good evening and take care, everyone. Bye-bye now.